The jagged cliffs of Zarion, 7 stretched high into the stormy sky. Winds howled through the rocks and dark clouds hung low, making the world below feel wild and dangerous. On the cliff's edge, a nest of dragon hatchlings squirmed and hissed. Their scales shimmered in sharp colors, from deep crimson to dark emerald, and their eyes glowed with curiosity and caution. No human had ever approached them safely. They were wild, feral, and untamed. Jax, a human mechanic, stepped carefully over the rocky terrain. His space suit was scratched and dusty from long travels across the planet. He had been sent to repair a supply drone that had crashed near the cliff. He knew the dragons were dangerous, but his job required him to get close. Unlike the soldiers and explorers who had tried before, Jax did not carry weapons. He carried tools and a lunchbox. He crouched down behind a rock to study the hatchlings. They moved quickly, hissing and snapping at each other. One of the bigger ones leapt over a small rock, claws digging into the stone, and opened its tiny mouth in a silent roar. They were not aggressive for no reason. They were protective, hungry, and cautious of anything unfamiliar. Jax took out his data pad and scanned the drone's wreckage from a distance. Sparks flickered where the power core had exploded and wires hung loose. He needed to get closer, but he could not risk startling the dragons. Slowly, he unpacked his tools, keeping his movements calm and deliberate. The hatchlings noticed him immediately. Their heads turned, eyes glowing in the dim light. They hissed in low tones, a warning that they were ready to defend their nest. One of the smallest hatchlings crawled toward the edge of the nest and sniffed the air. The wind carried Jax's scent, but it also carried something else, something new. Jax opened his lunchbox. Inside were roasted protein cubes and a few pieces of fresh vegetables. He knew the hatchlings were carnivorous, but humans had food that smelled different, something unfamiliar. He set a small portion on a flat rock near the nest, far enough that no hatchling would feel cornered. Then he sat back, keeping his hands visible. The dragons hesitated. One of the bolder hatchlings crept closer, its nostrils flaring. It sniffed the air, then stared at the food. It hissed softly, a sound of uncertainty. Jax remained still, letting the hatchling decide. Slowly, it inched closer and tapped the roasted cube with its snout. It recoiled at the taste, then sniffed again, realizing it was edible. The other hatchlings watched carefully, crouched low, ready to strike if needed. But the first hatchling's cautious approval gave them courage. One by one they inched forward, sniffing and tasting. Jax remained calm, speaking softly in his own language. The sound was low and rhythmic, not a command but a promise that he meant no harm. After a while the hatchlings were eating openly. They still hissed at sudden movements, but they no longer lunged. Jax took this moment to study them. He noticed patterns in their movements, how the smallest one always followed the largest, how the mid-sized ones practiced hopping between rocks. Each had its own personality, even at this young age. Hours passed and Jax began repairing the drone. He worked carefully, aware of the hatchling's eyes following every motion. Sparks flew from his welding tool and smoke curled into the sky, but none of the dragons attacked. They seemed fascinated by his actions, observing like students learning from a teacher. A sudden gust of wind sent pebbles rolling down the cliff. The hatchling scrambled back, hissing in alarm. Jax held his hands up, showing no threat. Slowly the dragons relaxed again. He realized that patience was more powerful than force. He could not rush them or frighten them. Every step had to be gentle, every movement calm. As the sun began to set, the sky glowed orange and purple. The hatchlings were calmer now, some even touching the edges of the tools or inspecting his lunchbox. Jax smiled faintly. Today he had made progress where soldiers and explorers had failed. He had approached the wild dragons not with weapons, but with food, patience, and understanding. Night fell and the winds grew colder. Jax packed up some tools and stored the drone's parts in a safe container. The hatchlings curled together, sleeping near the rocks. He left a small portion of his food for them, careful not to disturb their rest. Before leaving he whispered softly, "Tomorrow I'll be back. We can try again." As he descended the cliff he looked back. The hatchlings were small and wild, yet something had changed. They had begun to trust him in a way no human had ever achieved. The thought filled Jax with determination. He knew the next steps would be harder. He would need to earn their full trust, but he also knew it could be done. The wild nest, once untouchable, had opened just a small window to a human. And through patience, observation, and the simple act of sharing a meal, a connection had begun. A connection that could change the way humans and dragons interacted forever. Jax disappeared into the shadows of the cliffside, leaving the hatchlings to sleep safely. He felt a quiet pride and an unshakable curiosity. Tomorrow he would return and the story of the feral dragon hatchlings and the human mechanic would continue to unfold, step by step, through trust, courage, and a shared understanding that crossed the boundaries of species. The stars above shone brightly over the cliff, casting light on a world that was wild, dangerous, and full of possibilities. And in the quiet, the hatchlings stirred in their nest, dreaming of new discoveries, not knowing that the human who had shared his lunch with them would soon become part of their story, and a bridge between human ingenuity and dragon instinct. The morning sun broke over the cliffs of Zarion 7, casting golden light on the jagged rocks. Jax returned to the wild nest with his tools and a small lunch. The wind carried the smell of his roasted protein and fresh vegetables across the cliffside. He noticed the hatchlings stirring in their nest, their tiny heads lifting as they sniffed the air. The smell reached them quickly. One of the bolder hatchlings, the crimson-scaled one from yesterday, hopped closer to the edge of the nest. Its eyes glimmered with curiosity, and it tilted its head as it watched Jax unpack his food. The other hatchlings followed cautiously, huddled together, still wary but drawn by the scent. Jax set a small portion of his lunch on a flat rock near the nest. He stayed calm and motionless, hands open and visible. He knew that any sudden movement could scare them away. Slowly, the crimson hatchling crept forward, sniffing the air, then touching the food with its snout. It recoiled at first, but the smell was too tempting. After a brief pause, it nibbled gently, testing the taste. The other hatchlings watched. One by one they approached, circling the rock and sniffing. Their curiosity overcame fear. They sniffed, tapped, and eventually tasted the food, discovering that the human's lunch was safe and even enjoyable. Jax spoke softly, keeping his voice low and steady. "It's okay. You can try it." As the hatchlings began to eat, Jax observed their behavior. The bold crimson hatchling led the others, showing small movements for safety. The smallest one, green-scaled with golden eyes, hesitated at first, staying back. Jax did not force it. He left a tiny portion closer to the edge and slowly, it inched forward. He smiled quietly when it finally tasted the food. The scent of the human's lunch had broken the barrier of fear. The hatchlings circled him, occasionally sniffing his hands and the tools. Jax knew this was the first step toward trust. He carefully set down a wrench and a small metal panel near the nest. The hatchlings inspected them curiously but did not touch them aggressively. They were learning that he meant no harm. Hours passed, and Jax worked on the crash drone while the hatchlings watched from nearby rocks. Sparks flickered from the repairs and wires sparked with electricity, but the dragons did not attack. They were fascinated, tilting their heads and watching his precise movements. Occasionally one would reach forward and tap a small tool with its claw, retreating quickly if it felt unsure. Jax remained calm, speaking soft encouragements. At midday, Jax took a short break and opened his lunch again. The smell drifted toward the hatchlings, who approached more boldly this time. One of the mid-sized hatchlings, dark emerald in color, touched the food and then nudged a small stone toward it, as if experimenting. Jax laughed softly. "Good thinking," he whispered. Curiosity grew stronger than caution. The hatchlings began following him as he moved between rocks, inspecting the drone and the surrounding area. They mimicked small movements like tapping a loose wire or peering under a panel. Jax realized that they were not only curious about the food but also about him and the work he was doing. They were learning from observation, a trait humans valued highly. The wind picked up and dust swirled around the cliffside. The hatchlings huddled together, but none of them ran away. Jax slowly moved closer to the nest, speaking softly, letting them see his calm expressions. They began to recognize him as something different from the humans who had approached before. He was not a threat, but a friend who shared food and moved carefully. By evening, the hatchlings were bold enough to playfully interact with Jax. The crimson hatchling tapped his boots, then darted back to the nest. The green one followed, nudging a small rock toward him. Jax smiled. He realized that trust was growing and curiosity had paved the way. The dragons were learning that this human was not dangerous. As night approached, the hatchling settled back into the nest. Jax packed away his tools but left small pieces of food near the edge. He whispered softly, "Tomorrow we will continue. We can learn together." The hatchlings stirred slightly as if understanding, and the faint glow of their eyes seemed to reflect a new sense of acceptance. Walking down the cliffside, Jax felt a quiet pride. The feral dragons, untouchable and feared by many, were slowly letting him enter their world. It was not through force or fear, but through curiosity, patience, and the simple act of sharing a meal. The scent of his lunch had opened a door that no weapon or authority could. Above, the stars began to shine, casting light over the wild nest. The hatchlings curled together, sniffing the remaining food, while dreaming of new experiences. Jax looked back, knowing that the bond between them was only beginning. He had earned a small place in their world, and tomorrow he would take another step. The feral dragons were still wild, still cautious, but a spark of connection had been made. Human ingenuity, patience, and the willingness to understand had begun to bridge the gap between species. The scent of curiosity carried on the wind had changed everything. The next morning, Jax returned to the cliffside with tools in hand and a fresh lunch packed. The sky was clear, and the air carried the faint scent of the rocky cliffs mixed with the spicy aroma of his food. The hatchlings were awake, stretching their tiny wings and flicking their tails. Their glowing eyes followed him as he approached, but this time they did not retreat. Jax set down his lunch carefully on a flat stone near the nest. He sat a few steps away and watched quietly, letting the smell reach the hatchlings before making any sudden movements. The crimson hatchling, bold as ever, hopped forward first. Its tiny claws scraped against the stone as it sniffed the food. The other hatchlings hesitated for a moment, then one by one they crept closer. This time something different happened. The crimson hatchling reached out with its claw and touched the edge of Jax's hand near the food. It recoiled immediately, but curiosity won over fear. Jax stayed still, his fingers relaxed and open. "Good," he whispered softly, careful not to startle it. The hatchling touched his hand again, more confidently this time, and then nudged a piece of roasted protein toward its mouth. The green-scaled hatchling, the smallest one, watched intently. Slowly, it inched forward, sniffing Jax's boots and the edge of the lunchbox. Tentatively, it touched a piece of food with its snout, tasting it cautiously. Jax smiled quietly. "You're learning," he said softly. "We can do this together." The other hatchlings, encouraged by their siblings, began to explore the area around Jax. They sniffed his tools, tapped the edges of the drone panels, and even nudged a loose wire. Jax observed carefully, noting how each one had a different personality. Some were bold and curious, some cautious and clever. He realized he could teach them, slowly and carefully, without force. Hours passed and Jax began working on the damaged drone. Sparks flickered as he rewired circuits, but the hatchlings did not flee. Instead, they watched with wide eyes, tilting their heads and leaning forward. One of the mid-sized hatchlings touched a metal panel, then tapped it gently with a claw, seemingly trying to understand it. Jax chuckled softly. "You're smart," he whispered. "Very smart." Suddenly, a small gust of wind blew dust and pebbles toward the nest. The hatchlings hissed in alarm and crouched low. Jax raised his hand slowly, showing he meant no harm. The crimson hatchling watched him carefully, then relaxed, nudging another hatchling to follow its lead. They returned to the food and the tools, reassured that he was not a threat. By midday, the hatchlings had grown bolder. They followed Jax as he moved between rocks, sometimes brushing against his legs or touching his hands. One of the emerald-scaled hatchlings even tried to climb onto his knee, hesitating halfway. Jax laughed softly and held still, letting it explore without fear. The small gesture of trust was a breakthrough. The scent of his lunch continued to help. Each time he opened the box, the hatchlings approached more confidently, interacting not just with the food but with him. They began to mimic his movements, observing how he handled the drone tools and moving small rocks or sticks as if imitating him. Jax realized that curiosity had turned into learning. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Jax packed away the tools he did not need. The hatchlings had begun to follow him around the cliff, staying close but still cautious. They hissed softly at sudden movements, but they did not flee. The first contact had been made, they were no longer untouchable. Jax decided to test the limits carefully. He reached out a hand toward the crimson hatchling, holding a small piece of roasted protein. The hatchling sniffed, hesitated, then took the food directly from his fingers. The other hatchlings watched, fascinated. Slowly, one by one, they accepted food from him, touching his hands with claws or snouts before tasting. The scene was almost magical. The feral dragons, once feared by everyone, were now interacting with a human without aggression. Jax understood that trust was fragile and must be nurtured. He spoke softly, moved slowly, and remained calm. Every small touch, every sniff, every tentative bite built the foundation of a new bond. Even as night approached, the hatchlings stayed near him. Jax left small portions of food close to their nest, careful not to crowd them. He whispered, "Tomorrow we can do more. We will learn together." The hatchlings settled back into the rocks, glowing eyes reflecting the last light of the day. They seemed to sense that this human was different, patient, calm, and not a threat. Walking down the cliffside, Jax looked back at the nest. The hatchlings were still wary, but curiosity and trust had replaced fear. He felt a quiet pride. No one else had ever achieved this. They were beginning to accept a human in their world, and the bond, fragile as it was, had been made. High above, the stars shone over the cliffside. The hatchlings huddled together, softly hissing, sniffing the remaining pieces of food. They were still wild, but something had changed. A human had entered their world, not with weapons or commands, but with patience, curiosity, and a simple lunch. Jax disappeared into the shadows, leaving the hatchlings to rest. He felt the spark of a growing bond, a connection that would deepen over time. Tomorrow would be another test, another chance to prove that humans could communicate, learn, and understand, even with creatures as untamed and feral as the dragon hatchlings. The morning sun painted the cliffs of Zarion 7 in shades of gold and red. Jax returned to the wild nest with his tools and fresh lunch. The hatchlings were awake, stretching their wings and flicking their tails, their glowing eyes scanning the cliffs. Unlike before, they did not retreat when he approached. Instead, curiosity shone brighter than fear. Jax carefully placed a small portion of his lunch on a flat stone near the nest. He knelt a few steps away and spoke softly. The crimson hatchling, the boldest of the group, crept forward first. It sniffed the air, then tapped Jax's hand lightly before taking a piece of food. The other hatchlings watched, then followed, one by one, more confidently than before. After breakfast, Jax began working on the crash drone. Sparks flew as he repaired wires and replaced panels, but the hatchlings did not retreat. Some observed from nearby rocks, while others inched closer, tapping at small tools or nudging loose screws with their claws. One emerald-scaled hatchling, the cleverest of the group, even tried to mimic Jax's movements, nudging a wire in the same direction he did. Jax smiled softly. "You're learning," he whispered. "We can do this together." He moved carefully, keeping his gestures slow and calm. Every small action reinforced that he meant no harm. The hatchlings began to trust him more with each passing hour. Suddenly, a strong gust of wind swept across the cliff, sending loose pebbles rolling toward the nest. The hatchlings hissed in alarm, crouching low. Jax held his hands up, showing calm and reassurance. The crimson hatchling hesitated, then slowly stood, nudging another hatchling to follow. One by one the others returned, reassured that he was not a threat. By midday the hatchlings had grown more confident. They began to move closer to Jax while he worked, brushing against his legs or observing the tools he used. The smallest green-scaled hatchling even climbed onto a rock near his knee, peering at the drone's wiring. Jax laughed softly and stayed still, letting it explore. Each small touch, each gentle interaction strengthened their bond. Jax decided to test their trust further. He held a small panel in his hand and extended it toward the crimson hatchling. The hatchling sniffed and tapped it with a claw, then nudged it gently with its snout. Encouraged, Jax allowed it to touch and explore the panel freely. Slowly the other hatchlings followed, each investigating the tools and parts in their own way. As the sun reached its peak, Jax paused for lunch. The smell of roasted protein drifted toward the hatchlings, who approached boldly now, brushing against him and each other. The crimson hatchling nudged his hand before taking a piece of food. The others followed, some even trying to reach small portions on his tools. Jax laughed softly, feeling a quiet pride. Trust had been earned, not through force but through patience and care. Afternoon brought a challenge. A sudden dust storm blew across the cliff, whipping wind and sand toward the nest. The hatchlings hissed and flinched, seeking shelter. Jax moved quickly, placing larger rocks and panels as makeshift covers to shield them. The hatchlings huddled under the protection he had created, glancing up at him with wide, trusting eyes. When the storm passed, the hatchlings stayed close to Jax. They followed him as he continued repairing the drone, inspecting the wires and panels with curiosity. Some mimicked his actions, nudging screws or tapping tools in the same way he did. Others curled near his boots, resting but alert, showing that they now felt safe in his presence. By evening the bond was clear. The hatchlings were no longer wild in the same way. They were playful, curious, and brave, responding to Jax's calm gestures and words. The crimson hatchling even nudged his hand for attention, and Jax gently patted its head. The green-scaled one climbed onto a rock near him, watching every movement. Jax packed away the tools he did not need for the night, leaving small portions of food near the nest. He whispered softly, "Tomorrow we will do more. We will learn and grow together." The hatchlings huddled together, soft hisses of contentment and curiosity filling the nest. They were still young and wild, but trust had begun to take root. Walking down the cliffside, Jax looked back at the nest. The hatchlings were not running or hiding. They had accepted him as part of their world. He felt a quiet pride and determination. Trust, he knew, was fragile, but it could grow into something powerful. He had earned a small place in their lives, and tomorrow would bring new chances to strengthen it. The stars began to shine above the cliffs, and the hatchlings rested under the soft glow. Their glowing eyes reflected the light, a sign of curiosity, trust, and a growing bond with the human mechanic. Jax disappeared into the shadows, leaving them to sleep safely, knowing that patience, kindness, and careful observation had transformed fear into a fragile friendship. The cliffs of Zarion 7 were still wild and dangerous, but the hatchlings were learning that humans could be trusted. And one human mechanic, with nothing but food, tools, and patience, had begun to show that curiosity and understanding could bridge the gap between species, turning untouchable wildness into a bond that promised a brighter, safer future. The sun rose slowly over the cliffs of Zarion 7, casting light across the jagged rocks and the wild nest. Jax returned, carrying his tools and a fresh lunch. The hatchlings were already awake, their glowing eyes following him closely. This time they did not hesitate or hiss. They approached confidently, circling him with curiosity and excitement. Jax placed his lunch on a flat rock near the nest and knelt calmly. The crimson hatchling stepped forward first, touching his hand before taking a small piece of food. The others followed, moving freely around him, brushing against his legs and examining the tools he had brought. They had grown bold and trusting. Today, Jax focused on repairing the drone completely. Sparks flew as he rewired circuits and replaced broken panels, but the hatchlings did not retreat. Instead, they explored around him, sniffing wires, tapping panels, and nudging loose screws. One emerald-scaled hatchling even climbed onto a safe spot on the drone, peering at the wiring and flapping its small wings in excitement. Jax watched them carefully. "You're helping me already?" he whispered. "Keep watching and learning." The hatchlings seemed to understand. They moved with him, following his gestures and exploring the tools in ways that showed intelligence and curiosity. Each action built the bond stronger. As midday approached, Jax opened his lunch. The scent drifted across the cliff, drawing the hatchlings closer. They did not need encouragement anymore. They approached freely, some nudging his hands, others tugging at small tools or rocks. The crimson hatchling even tapped the drone gently as if pointing out something wrong. Jax laughed softly. "Good job. You're learning fast." Suddenly, a loose rock rolled near the edge of the nest. The hatchlings flinched, but Jax reacted quickly. He moved to block the rock, speaking softly to calm them. The hatchlings looked at him, then back at each other, realizing they were safe. Trust had grown into understanding. They now knew he would protect them as they explored the world. By afternoon, the hatchlings were actively participating. They nudged tools into position, inspected the repaired circuits, and even helped by pointing out loose wires. Jax allowed them to explore safely, guiding them when necessary. He realized that these dragons, once untouchable and feared, had become partners in his work. The green-scaled hatchling climbed near his knee and tapped a panel with its claw. The crimson one nudged a small wire into place. Jax smiled. "You're my team now," he said softly. "We're a team." For the first time, the dragons seemed to respond to his words, their glowing eyes showing excitement and understanding. As evening approached, the drone was finally repaired. Sparks from the last connection flickered and died, and the hum of the power core returned. Jax leaned back, exhausted but happy. The hatchlings chirped softly, brushing against him and the drone, as if celebrating their success. Jax stood and stretched, looking at the cliffside. The hatchlings followed him to the edge, moving freely and confidently. They had transformed from wild, untouchable creatures into a small, trusting group that allowed a human into their lives. Their bond was fragile but strong, built on patience, understanding, and shared experiences. He decided to leave some of his food near the nest for the night. The hatchlings gathered around it, eating together without fear. Jax whispered, "Tomorrow we explore more. We learn together. You're part of this world and I'm part of yours." The hatchlings huddled close, their soft hisses and gentle movements showing acceptance and trust. Walking down the cliff, Jax felt a quiet pride. He had accomplished something no other human had. He had earned the trust of creatures considered untouchable, not through weapons or commands, but through curiosity, patience, and simple acts of care. The bond was now mutual, they trusted him and he trusted them. At night, the stars glowed above the cliffs. The hatchlings slept in the nest, their bodies curling together for warmth. The crimson one twitched slightly, dreaming, while the green and emerald hatchlings rested nearby. The cliffside was still wild and dangerous, but now it was also a place of connection, trust, and cooperation. Jack sat on a nearby rock, looking at them with satisfaction. He knew this was only the beginning. These hatchlings could grow strong, explore the world, and even help humans understand the wild creatures of Zerion 7. The partnership they had formed was unique, a sign that humans with patience, understanding, and care could achieve what no force or authority ever could. The cliff was quiet, except for the soft breathing of the hatchlings and the distant wind. Jax thought about tomorrow, about further repairs, further learning, and further trust. He had discovered that even the most untouchable creatures could accept a human if approached with kindness, curiosity, and patience. And as he rose to leave, the hatchlings followed him for a few steps, not out of fear but out of companionship. They had formed a new alliance, a bond between human and dragon that would last and grow stronger. The cliffs of Zerion 7 were no longer just a wild, untamed place. They were a symbol of what humans could achieve: trust, cooperation, and the ability to connect with the unknown. Jax disappeared into the night, leaving the hatchlings to their nest. They huddled together, safe and curious, dreaming of a future where humans and dragons could explore the world side by side. The wild had been tamed, not by force but by understanding, patience, and a simple human touch. The new alliance was born, and with it, a brighter, safer, and more connected future awaited both species.